go from Judea in the south to Galilee in the north. You could go straight north, and you could go through Samaria, or you could go across the Jordan River and go up through Perea and cross back over south of the Sea of Galilee. In taking that route, you would avoid the Samaritans, the people that were so deeply hated by the Jews. Jesus is taking the direct route. He's going right through the heart of Samaria, which brings him to this city called Sychar in verse 5. And it's about noon. He's been walking apparently all morning long. Again, walking. I mean, these people lived rigorous lives. And Jesus is walking, and he's hot, and he's tired, and he sits down at the mouth of this well. A well that's described as being on a plot of ground that Jacob gave to his sons, and it is the well of Jacob. It's the well that Jacob actually had dug a long time previously. As we noted, there's a deep rift here, historical rift, between the Jews and the Samaritans. In fact, in verse 7, it talks about this woman of Samaria coming to draw water, and being a Samaritan, she would have been one of the descendants of the generation of people that were brought in by the Assyrians in the 700s BC. When the Assyrians came in and invaded the northern kingdom of Israel, they removed the Jews who were in Israel out of the land, and they brought other people from other lands that they had conquered into the land of Israel. In the course of transplanting those people, they adopted, inherited some of the same customs and practices and beliefs as the Jewish people, but they were by no means truly Israelites. And yet they continued to dwell in that land for 700 years. And as they did so, the animosity was very strong between the Jews and the Samaritans. They were considered not only genetically, but doctrinally and politically and every other which way to be hybrids. And so the Jews rejected them very, very strongly. Well, the woman comes out to the well. Jesus is sitting there, and it says it's about the 6th hour. By Roman reckoning, it seems like that would be probably the noon hour. And when she comes out, Jesus says to her, "Give me a drink." Well, that sounds like a fairly reasonable icebreaker or a request if you're wanting to talk with someone. Jesus is hot and tired, and she has come out. She has something to draw from the well with. Jesus doesn't have anything. I believe I read somewhere that the well was probably about 90 feet deep. So you had to bring some kind of a container to get the water up out of the well. I'm sure there was a pulley system on that by which they would physically lift the water up and then put in their own containers that they had brought to the well. But Jesus is asking her for a drink, and this is a complete breach of social protocol. For the disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. In verse 8, the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me?" She doesn't just say a Samaritan, she says a Samaritan woman. In that day and time, in public, men did not speak to women, even their wives. There was a very clear gender distinction here in which women were treated in a very inferior way. But beyond that, this is a Samaritan woman, and he is a Jewish man. In other words, this is not done. And she responds, I think, with some sharpness here. She doesn't obviously say, "Well, sir, I'd be glad to help you out." She says, "What are you doing talking to me? This is not done." Jesus then in verse 10 completely flips the script on her. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Now again, it's an interesting exercise for us to read certain passages like this and try to forget what we know. which is hard to do. Forget what we know about the gospel and about God's love for all men and the desire to save all men and our understanding of what all is involved in the gospel. This woman doesn't have any knowledge of any of that. She just knows that this person whom she despises, and she assumes despises her, a Jewish man, has made a request of her that's a breach of social protocol. It's not normal. This is not usual. Maybe she's suspicious. What are you up to? Why are you talking to me? But Jesus wants to get her off of that mindset into a wholly different mindset. Actually, he's got something to offer her that is much more valuable than a drink of water. But he interests her by using the terminology of the water that they are there at the source of, this well. And so Jesus said, actually, it's not that I want water from you, is that you should be wanting water from me. She's somewhat intrigued by that. Verse 11, the woman said to him, Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Let me ask you the question, if you were here for previous lessons, especially the one I did about Nicodemus in chapter 3. What mistake is this woman making that Nicodemus made? Jesus said to Nicodemus at the beginning of their conversation, unless a man is born again, he shall not see the kingdom. And what did Nicodemus say? Now, again, we understand Nicodemus is not a dunce. He knows that there's no such thing as a physical rebirth. We can't get in our mother's wombs again and come out. But what Nicodemus is saying is, I know you don't mean that, but I don't really know what you mean. But Nicodemus is on a very fleshly level in listening to Jesus. And that's what Jesus goes on and says. I'm speaking about heavenly things, and I'm dumbing it down for you, Nicodemus, and you're still not getting it. That's essentially what Jesus said to him. Now Jesus speaks of living water in verse 10, and the woman, like Nicodemus, is so carnally minded, she's so bereft of spiritual attunement that she's basically like Nicodemus, scratching her head and going, I really don't know what you mean by that. Are you, and then she's, are you greater than Jacob? You got water to drink that's living water that I have to come here to this well all the time. By the way, Jacob lived somewhere around 1,700 years before this. That well is still giving water. 1,700 years later. Now, Jesus is talking about some other water, not what's in that well. And she's going, basically, who do you think you are? Are you greater than our father Jacob? We've been revering Jacob for all of our history, at least as long as the Samaritans have been in the land. We said that's about 700 years. But you see how, in her mind, she's kind of adopted Jacob. Jacob is our father, and he lived 1,700 years before, even though they'd only been in the land 700. But she doesn't understand what Jesus is saying. So, are you greater than our father Jacob? Where do you get that living water? Where are you going to get water, so-called living water here, basically flowing water, not water that would come from a well? And so Jesus in verse 13 begins to use her questioning to draw a distinction. Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. So Jesus is acknowledging to this woman that he is not talking about the water out of that well. He says, this water and the water that I shall give. Whoever drinks of this water will get thirsty again. You'll have to come back here and draw. The water I'm talking about not only is water that truly satisfies, but I can make it become a source of water within you to where you're constantly nourished. You're constantly fed by the water that I shall give. And at this point, the woman seems to be very intrigued now. Rather than be put off because he's a Jewish man speaking to her, she says, well, give me this water. What? So that I don't have to come here to draw. She's still very much on a fleshly plane of thinking. So let's begin reading in verse 16, because Jesus is going to now sort of violently change the subject on her. Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands. And the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly. Whoa. How's that for changing the subject in the conversation? Actually, he hasn't changed the subject. He's just taking it in a different direction. Because what he's going to try to say to her is, I have water that will solve your sin problem, your moral problem. It'll affect your relationship with God. But he's bringing in something that would indicate to her that he needs to be listened to. You remember in chapter 1, when Jesus was first being introduced to Nathanael. And he said, I saw you under the fig tree before you even came. And Nathanael was stunned that Jesus would have known something about him that he should not have known. Jesus had not been with him earlier. How did you know I was under the fig tree? And that duly amazes Nathanael. He's doing the same thing with this woman. This traveler going through town, sitting at the well, never met before, knows her marital history and current situation. And he's bringing up her immorality in order to get her to understand something about the water that he's wanting to provide for her. But in order to do that, he amazes her by revealing knowledge that he should not know. What impact does this have on the woman? In verse 19, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. You remember what Nicodemus said in the last chapter? We know you're a prophet come from God, because nobody can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Nicodemus and this woman are correct, but they're not correct enough. Jesus is a prophet in the most generic sense of the term. A prophet's merely one that speaks for God, speaks with the authority of God, and Jesus certainly is that. But he's more than a prophet. And that's what he wants to get this woman to see. Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Then notice how she changes the subject. Verse 20, our fathers worshipped on this mountain. She's referring to Mount Gerizim, which is right beside this well. So you can probably picture her gesturing. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. And you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. You see what she does? She tries to change the subject and get it off of her marital status and onto the controversy of the day. Where should we actually worship? This is the main point of contention between Samaritans and Jews. The temple in Jerusalem is the place where worship has been centered, where God had said in the Old Testament, where I have chosen to put my name, where sacrifices had been offered now for centuries for the sins of the people. The priesthood was serving the people in that locale. Jerusalem was the capital city of the nation. She says, what do you think about this controversy? Where should we be worshiping today? Well, Jesus doesn't sidestep her. He answers her, probably with an answer she didn't really want. But he answers her in this way. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. Let me tell you, you needed to be careful what question you asked Jesus, because he would give you the answer. And it was not an answer she wanted to hear, because he actually answers her very forthrightly and very truthfully. He says, you worship what you do not know. Well, that's not very politically correct, is it? You worship what you do not know. The Samaritans only acknowledged the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They disavowed everything else. They were worshiping in Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem, where God had said, I put my name. They were a hybrid religion. And this is what Jesus says. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. You remember, if you were here for our class before, you remember what Paul said in Ephesians 2 that Brad very well pointed out? The Gentiles were completely separated from the Jewish nation and from God. They were not subject to the law of Moses. They were not following the law of Moses in its entirety. They were following the first 5 books to a certain degree. But it's a religion that only had the flavor of Judaism. It did not follow Judaism in all of its detail, and that's what Jesus says to her. But he wants to get her beyond the current controversy. He answers her, but he said, you know what, there's something more important. Verse 21, he said, woman, believe me, the hour is coming. What has Jesus and John both been, what have they been teaching and baptizing for? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Something is breaking here. Something's about to happen. This sense of anticipation. You're to be baptized under the baptism of John in view of what is transpiring and will come to its fullness soon. That's what Jesus says. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when where you worship will not be an issue. Now, it was an issue as long as the law of Moses was in place. Again, what did we learn in Ephesians 2 this morning in our class? Jesus fulfilled the law. He abrogated it. He did everything the law had said would happen, and it took it out of the way, not having broken it or destroyed it from the outside, but from the inside, having fulfilled it. In that action, he not only provides for the perfect sacrifice for sin, he provides for our union with God and our union with each other, he provided for something else. And that is, you could now be a child of God and worship him anywhere on the planet. You didn't have to be tied to Mount Gerizim. You didn't have to be tied to Jerusalem. You don't have to be tied to Rome. You don't have to be tied to any physical location. It's a major change that's coming, and Jesus is only indicating that part of it here because of her question. But let's read further. Verse 23, the hour is coming and now is. It's happening in front of your eyes, is what he's saying. It's happening in front of your eyes. When the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit. And those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Again, when you see like the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians, chapter 1, he repeats himself about those that are teaching any other gospel than what has been preached, let him be accursed. He repeats himself. When you see a verse or a phrase repeated almost verbatim, the person's wanting to drive that point home. And Jesus wants to drive this point home. Whether Jew or Gentile or Samaritan, God is looking for true worshipers. When he says worship in spirit, he doesn't mean spiritedly. Although that may be part of our worship, not unbridled emotionalism. But with the Spirit is what he's saying. I don't want people to worship me in rituals. I don't want people to mindlessly go through certain steps of worship. I want people to worship me with the Spirit. Because that's how God is contacted, if you will. What does he go on to say? God is Spirit. We're spirit. We're not spirit only. We have a body. We have a fleshly, carnal body in which resides a spirit. So we are spiritual beings that at this point in our existence exist in a material body. The way that we interact with God truly is when our inner spirit is engaged with Him. So Jesus says, God is instituting a way. The hour has come and now is. I'm unfolding this, which he'll basically say here in a minute. The hour is coming and now is where those who worship God must worship Him in spirit. What did he says, and truth. What did he just say to the Samaritan woman? You're worshiping ignorantly. You don't even know what you're worshiping, and you're not even doing it correctly. Worshiping God in truth has always been a fundamental element of worship that's acceptable to God. That goes back to Cain and Abel. God rejected Cain's offering and accepted Abel's offering because one of them was in accordance with what God had said and the other one wasn't, which led to the first murder. Worshiping God in spirit, with the Spirit, being spiritually engaged with God, and worshiping God in truth have always been the fundamental way to engage God. It's just that now Jesus is saying there's a change in the wind. There's something happening right in front of you that's going to take away all of these distinctions between Samaritans and Jews. God is Spirit, and that's what He's seeking. He's seeking people that want to worship Him, that want to engage with Him, that want to be in fellowship with Him. It has nothing to do with who your ancestor was, which is what the Jews argued in John 8 with Jesus. Oh, well, we're of our father Abraham. Well, Jesus said, no, you're not, really, because in spirit you more resemble the devil. He was a liar and a murderer from the beginning, and you want to murder me, so actually you're not really like your father Abraham. Genetically, you may have come from him, but you're nothing like him. Even genetic Jews, the relations back to Abraham, even they're going to have to stop disappointing God by worshiping by ritual, mindlessly. Have murder in their hearts, but at the same time they're singing their Hallel at the Passover. God is looking for spiritual worshipers. Now watch the woman's response. Verse 25, the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming. That's a pretty amazing thing for a Samaritan woman to say, especially since they did reject the Old Testament except for the Pentateuch. But even in the Pentateuch, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses said there'd be a prophet like him to come, and the people should listen to him. Even this woman's got a sense of expectation about there being a Savior and a Messiah. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When He comes, He will tell us all things. What had Jesus told her? What her marital status was, which he shouldn't have known. He will tell us all things. It's a leading question, is it not? She's leading Jesus somewhere, and He goes there. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am He. Chronologically, in the Gospels, this is the first time that Jesus acknowledges being the Messiah. To who? To the Sanhedrin? To His disciples? To His mother? To His brothers? Nope. To a Samaritan woman whom He should not have been speaking with anyway. Folks, it's another one of those examples in the Bible that God just doesn't do things the way we do them. God doesn't think the way that we think. And that's a real dangerous thing when it comes to our assumptions about God. We begin assuming things about God from our own human judgment, more than likely we're going to be flat wrong. Because God just doesn't think the way we do. God doesn't act the way that we do. God doesn't have the same attitudes that we do. I'm going to bypass most of what then happens after this. But the woman is duly amazed. She goes back into the town. The well is outside of the city. She goes back into the town, starts telling everybody that'll listen to her what just happened out at the well. You ain't going to believe this. There's this guy out there. You need to go see him because this is the Messiah. The disciples come back from buying food in the town. They're amazed because Jesus says, "No thanks, I'm not hungry." And they're like, "What do you mean you're not hungry? We've been walking all morning. We went into town to buy food. We come back and did somebody give you something to eat?" No, Jesus said, "I've got food to eat you don't know really anything about. My food is to do the will of him who sent me. That's my energy." Doesn't mean Jesus didn't need to eat. He's a human. He's got a human body to maintain, but surely you have been in a situation, have you not, where you're so enraptured with what you're doing at the moment, you're so taken by that and focused on it, you don't even realize, oh, it's been 6 hours since I ate. That's what Jesus is saying. This woman, in having a conversation with her, took away my appetite. This is what I'm most focused on. This is what demands my attention at this moment in time. And so, from the woman going back into the town, the people start coming out, and they want to find out, what is this woman talking about? So they go out, says in verse 39, many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, "He told me all that I ever did." So when the Samaritans had come to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days, and many more believed because of his own word. Then they said to the woman, "Now we believe not because of what you said, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world." That is a phenomenal statement for these people to make because they've been so religiously wrong all of their history. But Jesus has cut through all of that to get right to the heart of the matter. And that's to let them know that salvation that's come to the Jews specifically in Jesus' material life on earth. He said, "I did not come but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But he wants the Samaritans to know salvation has come. Now they're going to be preached. Remember in Acts chapter 8, Philip goes to Samaria and preaches the gospel. This is where Simon the sorcerer is living in this area. And they're duped by him until Philip comes. But these people are going to be able to hear the gospel later and respond to it, but Jesus is plowing up the ground here. A couple of observations and then we'll close the lesson. Number one, humans are always erecting illegitimate barriers which create denigration, hate, advantage for themselves over other people. Again, we talked about this in our class this morning. We create all kinds of sections and subsections, and we confer special status on certain ones based on a number of attributes that God has no care for. God isn't interested in economics. He's not interested in ethnicity. God isn't interested in your education. It's not that those things don't have identifying values or they can't be used in certain ways. But when it comes to standing before God, none of those things matter. And when Jesus faced that, he just dismissed it. When there was some artificial division placed between men or women, men and women in this case, he just dismissed it. This is not a woman to be ignored. This is not a woman to be shunned. Somebody that's beneath him because she's a Samaritan and he's a Jew. We made the observation in class this morning, men spend so much time, energy, and effort, and have throughout all of history, to try to solve these differences that they themselves create. But they try to solve these differences in all kinds of illegitimate ways, and it never works. Never works. Pacts and treaties and agreements and debates and discussions and conferences, none of that works. Because these differences come from the devil. That is how they're played up between people. This is the devil's work. It's the devil taking differences between us and then creating hierarchies among us. The gospel is designed to tear all of that down. This is why really the only way to achieve unity in this world is through the gospel. Because that brings us back to the very beginning principles of what a human being is and who God is before whom we live, and we are His creation. God is the one that's going to help us solve this problem. The tragedy is nobody wants to listen to God to solve the problem. We think the latest scheme, the latest political idea is going to help solve these tensions in the world. No, it's not. Never has, never will. Unity and oneness and respecting and loving each other as God wants us to, that comes from spiritual principles, not from pacts and treaties. Second thing I want to notice is that we would not expect Jesus to say what He says in verse 35. When the disciples come back and they're kind of surprised He's not wanting to eat, He says, my food, in verse 34, is to do the will of Him who sent me and finish His work. Verse 35, do you not say there are 4 months and then comes the harvest? Now watch what He says. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. He's saying that about the Samaritans. We often do not see the opportunities. You would not expect Jesus to say, the Samaritan hills are white for harvest, ready to be harvested. But Jesus saw this quite differently. This is why Jesus says, lift up your eyes and look at the fields. Because often we're not looking at the fields. We're looking at ourselves, we're looking at our own lives, we're distracted by the things of this world. We're not actually looking around ourselves. Yes, there are a lot of people around us that do not want to be saved. And we're probably not going to get very far with them. But at our reading at Wegmans on Thursday morning, we had an elderly gentleman join us. Out of the blue. Well, I think he actually did respond online first. But people do that all the time and don't ever come. But my point is, there are people around us that are searching. There are people around us that do have spiritual attunement. They may be hard to find, and especially as time goes on and society becomes more corrupt, they may be harder to find. But what does Jesus say? Lift up your eyes and look. Start a conversation with someone in public. I was out walking yesterday morning, and 2 young Mormon gentlemen were riding their bikes in my neighborhood. They were out trying to start conversations with people. We can do that as well. We can throw a reference to God or the Bible or some moral issue into a conversation and then see what happens. See if anyone takes us up on it. But my point, as Jesus is saying here, is that we need to be looking. You can, figuratively sort of imagine the disciples walking through Samaria like this, don't let me come in contact with these Samaritans. I don't want that. And they're not looking at the fields to go, are there any Samaritans here we could talk to? Jesus found one. And then thirdly, let me say this, that the woman that He's talking to has a lot of moral baggage. You've had 5 husbands and now you're living in an illicit relationship. Nicodemus had a lot of baggage, but it was different. It was religious baggage. Now, this woman had some of that too. But Nicodemus was completely consumed in his religiosity and didn't think he needed to be born again. What do I need to be born again for? I'm a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin Council. I got one of the highest standings in the land. And what did Jesus say to him? Are you a teacher of Israel and you don't know what I'm talking about? Everybody's got some baggage. Some people have a lot of baggage. But if they want to be saved, the gospel cuts through the baggage. There is nothing for a penitent soul that they have endured or done, suffered in this life, that God might say to them, well, I know you really want to be saved, but I'm sorry. I just can't do anything with somebody like you. Not to a penitent person. Now, there are people that let their baggage get in their way, and it stays in their way their whole life. The gospel is there to help them through that and to deal with that baggage. But you have to want to deal with it. You have to want to see that this is between me and God. This is an impediment. It's an obstacle between me and God, and I don't want there to be an obstacle there. What do I do about this? And the gospel's got the answer for that. I don't care what the baggage is. Abuse, poverty, bad marriage, children that have become unfaithful, you committed a crime. I mean, you fill in that blank. What is your baggage? What's keeping you from being fully in fellowship with God? What problem do you have that God hadn't thought about yet and thus doesn't deal with in His Word? You know as well as I do, there isn't anything in that category. The biggest impediment between us and God is between our ears. Here's where it is. It's not the gospel. The gospel can solve everything. The gospel is designed to create peace between us and God. So often we don't have that peace because we can't work through our own thoughts. But the gospel can help us do that, and that's the invitation today to everyone that's here. Have you worked through your baggage? Is there an impediment? Is there an obstacle? Is there something that's keeping you from God and serving Him, as Jesus said, in spirit and in truth? Wholly committed and devoted to Him and seeking the way that He wants to be worshiped and served, because that's serving Him in truth and worshiping Him in truth. We're going to sing a song of encouragement, and if you examine your soul, you examine your life, and you realize that there's something there between you and God. There is an impediment. There is a blockage of some kind. And there's a way that we can encourage you or study the Bible with you or pray with you. Anything we can do in this moment of time. God's invitation is open all of the time. But this is being extended because we happen to be here together today on the Lord's Day. And we don't want anybody leaving here with unresolved baggage. Can we help you with that while we stand and sing?